Welcome back. So let's review. Which of the rules that we talked about the difference between informal and formal academic writing do you remember best of those that I mentioned? So I was like, this is a test. What do you remember? Which one springs to mind first? Put your answer in the chat while we're waiting on, see if anybody else is coming. Yeah, no personal pronouns. No slang, good. Contractions? Yeah, no contractions. Good. Those are really the three major ones. No slang, no contractions, no personal pronouns. Especially personal pronouns make it feel less formal. Okay. Don't forget the others, right? A couple more. Try to avoid statements that start with there is, or there are, because they tend to be wordier. So you might say something like, there are several reasons to ban, I don't know, what are we going to ban today? To ban, what's something we should ban? Yes, yeah, they sound a little weaker when you're putting them in front of statements. Oh, I know, in New York, they're banning like extra large sodas. Fast food restaurants. Okay, so you can edit that to be stronger. Instead of saying there is or there are, banning extra large sodas. And instead of just saying there are several reasons, which is kind of an empty sort of phrase, you mention the reasons. Banning extra large sodas helps prevent obesity, helps people avoid temptation. And prevents large spills. I'm making it up today, guys. So generally you don't need a there is or there are at the beginning of a sentence. Sometimes you do. I mean, that's why we have those words. But usually when you go through an edit, you can edit to make a stronger sentence that has more specific content, as opposed to there are several amorphous reasons I'm mentioning here. Instead, mention the reasons. Okay. Also, avoid making absolute kind of statements like Everyone thinks the death penalty is bad. Just like I said with the Amazon reviews, there's always going to be some individual out there, you know, blazing individualist, who disagrees with something, right? So if you want to go for the majority, you want to say most Americans disapprove of the death penalty. And then, of course, you're going to provide us evidence from your sources that showed you that to back up what you're saying. Okay, so avoid the like everyone statements, all of us, no one thinks this, because generally those are not true, right? They're extreme. Okay. So keep these in mind when you're going through, and just use your normal like highlight words, check your words for the most formal version. Right? It's one of the other rules. All right, we spent a lot of time practicing so far how to add a paraphrase to your paper, right? You take a piece of information from your source, you put it in your own words, you integrate it into your paper. Now let's look at how to add quotations, right? Because those are the two things. Now, how much of your paper should be directly quoted material? What percentage approximately? I remember?
20%, I want to say.
Half it and you're there. Around 10%.
Oh, okay.
So let's say you're doing a 10-page paper. If you added up all the quotes throughout your paper, it'd be roughly a page. Now we're not going to kill you if it's like a page and a line or something like that. But you're just getting like, because quotes, guys, are more like a spice than a main ingredient. Okay? Too much spice will kill the recipe. You know, it starts to not sound like your paper or your voice. And you want to use them for a reason. So let's talk about using quotes. Look at some examples. You want to use them because they're well written, right? So the quote, taking something word for word, right, from a source. So it's interchangeably referred to as a quote or a quotation, and I'll use both terms usually when talking about it. Okay. So why do we need them? They said it really well. You know, if you like the way they said it, chances are your audience will think it's interesting or funny or profound also. So you want to share it with them because you're basically adding the spice, the interest to your paper. Also, because it comes from a very credible source, right? It comes from someone who knows their stuff, and you're using them to back up what you're saying, to support your ideas. Okay, so how do you include the quotations? It's basically very similar to how we're including the paraphrasing. You're going to need that signal phrase that signals you're about to introduce information from a source, right? So here's the example. Same thing, basically it's going to be the same way you use to introduce a paraphrase, as stated by Phil Olaf, the leading policy analyst from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. So you got two pieces of information here. You have the author's name, and you have their qualifications for speaking about this. Because if you took this out, you said, as stated by Phil Olaf, then we're just like, well, who's that guy? Do we care what he thinks? Does he have the expertise to be talking about this? So they give you a brief little statement, okay, sort of a mini resume here. So according to Phil Olaf, states are spending 2,353 or 28% less per student on higher education nationwide in the current 2013 fiscal year than they did in 2008 when the recession hit. Okay, so let's look at a couple punctuation features. They have the signal phrase, and to go from the signal phrase to the quote, they have a comma between the signal phrase and opening up the quotation marks right here. Okay. Since they've already mentioned his name and there's no citation here, then basically this is probably from a website that does not have stable page numbers. Otherwise, you could have in parentheses here the page number, and the period would go after the closing parentheses. Okay. Like this example here. This is what it would look like if you had a page number. You would take the period from here and move it over to show that this page number goes with this sentence. Everybody with me? And I posted one of these. Here's another example. According to Samantha Washington, a professor of psychology at Columbia University. So you can use these as templates, right? You can say, as stated by, according to, okay, or you can start with Samantha Washington declares, or denies, or disputes, or acknowledges, okay? Samantha Washington, a professor of psychology at Columbia University, acknowledges universities need to take a stand when it comes to rights in education. Again, so we have the comma here, open up the quotation marks, drop your quote in there, period, close quotation marks if you don't have an in-text citation at the end. And I posted some of these verbs too under the announcements. So if you get stuck for a way to introduce in the signal phrase, think about these. Okay. Sometimes if you're the subject of your paper is a piece of literature, you'll have quotations that stand by themselves, but please, for the most part, you're going to need a signal phrase. You know, you might use the standalone quotation if it's the subject of your paper. If you guys get into going into literature later and you're doing lit papers, that might be like this. But 90% of the time, you're going to need a signal phrase that leads into it. Okay. You can also integrate the quotation into your sentence. Okay, it can take the place of words or phrases, right? For example, Malcolm X said that when he picked up a book, most of the words might as well have been in Chinese. Remember that essay that we read on coming to an awareness of language early on? That's a quote from that essay. And listen to how it flows like a normal sentence. Malcolm X said that when he picked up a book, most of the words might as well have been in Chinese, as an example of his difficulty with reading. Okay. So when you do have a quote like this, do notice that if you're coming out of a quote and you're going into your words again, you're going to put a comma here and close the quotation marks like this. I find it striking that though women novelists have probably dominated American literature since the middle of the 19th century, our literary tradition is still incredibly gender specific. And see, they moved the period, right, after the closing parentheses because they had to cite, they didn't name the author up here, so they had to put the author right there, and it had a page number. So then, how does this work with the Works Cited? I wanted to find this author. I would flip to the last page. Works Cited is always on its own page by itself and lists all the sources that you've used in your paper. Okay? And then I would alphabetically look up this by the last name of the author. Questions so far? You guys are already out there? And I will post a link to this if you just want to go back and look, but you can also look on the Purdue OWL, right? It's got the examples here. So here's an example of integrating it into your sentence, but you want it to sound like a normal sentence. You don't want this part to sound like you slap something that doesn't belong onto the first part of the sentence. You don't want it to sound awkward when you read it. Okay. So you can see how the quotes are integrated And then if you have a page number, you take the period that normally would be here and you put it after the closing parentheses. If you don't have a page number, right, you put it right after the last letter before the closing quotation marks. So these will be things I'm looking for. Now, can you edit quotations? Yes, you can, and sometimes you need to, okay? Whenever you take exact words from a source, if you make any changes to it, which sometimes you need to add something for clarification purposes, or you need to take something out that's not necessary so you don't exceed your 10%, of quote limit in your paper. One of the things you can use are called square brackets. Okay, so anytime you need to add something to a quote to clarify something, because we don't see, excuse me, we don't see the original source. So you might be referring to something earlier in a sentence that we haven't seen and we need it clarified. So, for example, William Johnson stated, most students agree that they have trouble studying, but community college students have it tough. They often worry about taking care of their families and working full time as well. So in this case, they're using they so that the sentence flows well. Okay. Maybe you have a foreign word in a quote and your audience isn't going to be familiar with what it means. So after the foreign word in brackets, you're going to translate the word for your audience. Okay. Let's say, again, we'll go with that example where we didn't see the original source. So maybe the original source says, Cinderella was a pathetic character. The mice had to make her dress for her. Let me see, in the Disney version. In the Hans Christian, or in the Grimm version, she's pretty proactive. So this is from the original source, right? Okay, but I'm not going to use that first sentence. So if I only have in my quote, mice had to make her dress for her, you don't know who her is, right? Because you didn't see the sentence that came before if I'm not quoting it. So right after, in square brackets, to clarify what I'm talking about or who I'm talking about, I'm going to put Cinderella. That lets the audience know that I've made a change to the quote for clarity, basically. So that's what it would look like if I was just quoting it in the paper and I didn't quote that first sentence and you didn't know who the pronoun her referred to. Okay, so use square brackets to add clarification or explanations to quotes. Back and look at that again. Sometimes you'll see it around a letter. That just means they changed it from a capital letter to a lowercase letter or vice versa. Now, the other thing, so that's adding to it. If you add something, put in square brackets. Okay, just like this. Now, sometimes you want to quote a passage, but you don't need everything that's in the passage. Okay. If you leave words out of a quotation, you can include what we call ellipses, which are 3 spaced periods. This signals to the reader that you left out some words. Okay. So in the example, William Johnson stated, most students agree that they have trouble studying, And then they took out some words between studying and because they often have to worry about taking care of their families. Okay. You can use brackets and ellipses together, separately, whatever, however you need them to manipulate the quote best for your paper. Okay. So this tells me, if I see these 3 spaced dots, that there were some words here, but the author didn't consider them necessary. All right. Do not use ellipses for evil purposes like some people do. So you may have seen like some misleading movie reviews. So you might see this review. The movie ... was spectacular. Okay. We're like, okay, there were some words in between there. And the original that they took the words out of may have said something like this. Movie had no plot. The acting was bad. But the special
Are you
effects...
gonna post this later? Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I am.
Okay.
Were spectacular. So, is this... the movie was spectacular. Is that an accurate representation of what I just said? The original? The movie had no plot. The acting was bad, but the special effects were spectacular. No, they have misused their ellipses to lie, basically. So use your powers for good. Not evil. Okay. You don't want to misrepresent somebody's opinion about something. So don't use them to misrepresent what an authority is saying about a source or something like that. Okay. But if you don't need a passage, save your quotation space for something that you do need. It just might be an unnecessary word or two. But you don't want it taking up space that you could use for something else. All right. So yeah, if you can think of it like a sandwich, right? Where the signal phrase is the introduction of the quote. The quote itself is the middle. It's like the meat, the cheese, right? And the commentary on the quote, which is the next thing we need to talk about. Remember, we said explain your thinking. Okay. So if you put a quote into a paper, you have to explain to us how it supports what you're saying. All right. So you start by introducing the quotation. In his book, The Compadre, Dr. Torres explores the complexities of relationships. Okay. He emphasizes friendships can be very difficult to keep up, although intentions may be sincere, life can get in the way. You have to give some of your information, right, to explain the quotation. You put the quotation in there. So he introduces the concept, the claim, right? Relationships can be complex. Okay. This is substantiated by Dr. Torres when he states that communication can be the end all, be all of relationships, and additionally corroborates. So you see the flow of the commas before leading into the quotation marks. Modern research points out approximately 50% of arguments are caused by simple misunderstandings, all of which could have been avoided with proper communication. Okay. So we've got introducing the concept, then you've got the quote that supports it. Okay, now you have to comment on the quotation and connect the dots for us. Okay. Try never to leave a source, whether it's paraphrased or quoted, without an explanation of how you see it supporting the claim. Okay. So he gives us this quote about over half of the arguments are misunderstandings, right? So they're just basically explaining what he's saying in the quote. In our everyday lives, we incorrectly use communication without realizing the consequences that this can have on our relationships. With this in mind, we must strive to improve our communication skills. So they're basically commenting on the implications of that quote and that information. Okay. So they've showed how that quote supports their argument that communication is important in relationships. I'll give you guys a minute to read through that and see what they're doing. Look at this part that explains the quote. So you've got the sandwich. You've got that introduction of the idea. All right, top piece of bread. Then you've got the meat of the quotation. Then you got the bottom piece, which is you explaining the significance and how it supports or attaches to your subject. Okay. You close the quotation and you've made your argument clear. So let's try one out. So as stated by Martin Luther King Jr., one of the most prevalent activists in the American Civil Rights Movement. So what we have is we have used the name of the author of the quote. We've given them a little mini resume here, one of the most prevalent activists in the African American Civil Rights Movement. Okay. And then we've, comma, open the quotation, right? Human progress is neither automatic nor inevitable. Every step toward the goal of justice requires sacrifice, suffering, and struggle, the tireless exertion and passionate concern of dedicated individuals. All right. So if you were going to explain this quote and its significance in the world today, what would you say? I'm going to ask you guys to work on that and then share your answer in the chat. So we have Martin Luther King said it. We've got the quote. Okay, so he's saying human progress isn't an automatic thing. It requires, you know, sacrifice, suffering, struggle. Okay, the efforts of dedicated individuals. So you can start it with something like, I'll paste this in the chat. I'll give you a phrase to start the sentence with. So now you're going to fill in that part where you explain what his quote means. Okay. Now, once you've mentioned an author's name, you can refer to them by their last name. You don't want to do their first name. You don't want to say Martin is saying, because it's too informal, and we're sticking with formal for academic writing. So you'd start your explanation with what King is essentially saying is, excuse me, fill in the blank. Start with this phrase here and tell me what you think that quote means in the context of today's world. Paste your answer in the chat when you're done.
Can you post the quote in the chat?
Yes.
Thank you.
Why don't I share the screen so you guys can see it? There it is right there. Okay, we're gonna run out of time here in 5 minutes. So what I'm gonna do is go ahead and end this session, give you those 5 minutes to finish working on your explanation of the quote. And then I'll start a new session in about 5 minutes, and we can share all of our explanations of what we think the quote means. Okay, any questions? So I will see you about 9:25. Okay.
Can you paste the link to the quote?
Yes, I can.
Thank you.
Let me do that here. This is the handout, and I will be pasting it on Brightspace too. Pasting it.
So you just want us to tell you what we think it means when we come back?
That is correct. All right, I'll see you in about 5 minutes.